Cold air pooled in the concrete seams of Bornholmer Strasse as the crowd pressed toward the East German checkpoint. It was already dark on November 9th, 1989. The floodlights bleached faces and turned winter coats into a single mass, steaming where breath rose. A border guard lifted a loudspeaker and told everyone to go home. No one moved. In the booth behind him, a captain scanned a telex that said the new travel rules were effective immediately, a word tossed out in a press briefing, but never clarified to the men with rifles at the gates. People shouted that television had announced it. A woman held up her baby as proof she did not intend trouble. Another man, a mechanic, said he only wanted to see the West and come back by morning. The officers radioed for orders and got silence. Just before 10, the captain told his team to stop stamping passports and start waving people through. The barrier rose and stayed there. The stream became a current, then a surge. Berliners ran onto the bridge as if their legs had been waiting years for the command. The year had begun far away in Gdansk, with the same winter air and a different kind of order. On February mornings, workers still queued for bread and watched the state news insist that shortages were temporary. Inside a union office over the shipyard gate, Solidarity's organizers argued about how far to push. They settled on talks. In April, the government legalized the union. In June, the roundtable deal produced a vote that cracked the monopoly of power. When the ballots were counted, the old party kept its allotted share, and the rest fell like a wall of numbers to Solidarity candidates. A retired welder told a reporter he had waited his whole life to vote without lying to himself. Poland seated a non-communist prime minister before the summer ended. The world did not collapse. Workers still reported at dawn. Trains still ran. The lessons slipped past censors. It was possible. Southwest, the Hungarian frontier bent through quiet fields along the Austrian border. A lieutenant who had joined the border troops to escape factory work watched the fences decay each spring. The surveillance equipment was obsolete. The old mines had been lifted years earlier. On May 2nd, the government began dismantling the barrier outright, wire by wire. In August, at a picnic set up as a symbolic protest, families from the German Democratic Republic poured through a gate that had been propped open for a few hours. Some carried their belongings in shopping bags, others held only papers in children's hands. The lieutenant, sweating under a cap that no longer felt like authority, pretended to adjust his belt and looked away. The next weeks brought more East Germans into Hungary and then out to Austria. Camps filled with tents and rumors. Budapest made the decision in September to let them go. In East Berlin, the television showed nothing. People heard anyway, through cousins and postcards, and 1,000 small channels the state never controlled. On late summer afternoons in the Baltics, the road that connected Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn filled with people linking hands. 2 million formed a chain on August 23rd to mark the anniversary of the pact that had carved their countries into someone else's map. A driver stuck in the line stepped from his car and wiped his eyes. He said later he didn't know whether he was crying for grief or for finally seeing so many say aloud what had been said only in kitchens. It was not a revolution in the square. It was a lane of asphalt with palms touching, a statement that did not need a microphone. In Moscow, leaders talked of reform and warned of disorder. In each republic and satellite, people were learning the width of the space between those words. East Germany tried to clamp down. Passports were seized from travelers. Rallies were banned and then appeared anyway on Monday nights in Leipzig, where the candlelight flickered under the vaults of Nikolaikirche and then poured into the streets as a march. The phrase everyone shouted was simple: "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. A nurse who had never been at a demonstration before tucked her identification card into her sock and joined younger colleagues in the crowd. Riot police hesitated in rows. Plainclothes officers bled away into side streets when they realized they were outnumbered. On October 18th, the Central Committee forced out the man who had ruled for nearly 2 decades. Another functionary stepped in, heavy with promises that sounded like older ones. The crowds returned the following Monday. The nurse went back with them and found that fear didn't always return after it left once. Czechoslovakia's turn came in November, after students marched to mark an earlier generation's dead and were beaten with truncheons in Prague. Word spread that a student had been killed. It wasn't true, but the rumor moved people into Wenceslas Square and onto balconies, where actors led chants because the theaters had closed in protest. A student named Pavel stood on a crate outside the post office to talk to strangers about how they would keep the peace when the police lines shifted. He had never held a megaphone. By the end of the week, he no longer needed one. The square made its own sound, keys clinking like rain as people held them up to show they were ready to unlock doors or lock the old order away. The Communist Party resigned by the first week of December. A playwright took the oath of office as president. Those who had copied his banned scripts by hand now brought flowers to the castle. Bulgaria replaced its leader quietly on November 10th, the day after the Berlin gates swung. In Romania, the quiet never came. In mid-December, a pastor in Timișoara refused to yield his pulpit to the secret police. Crowds gathered to protect him and then to denounce more than a summons. Troops opened fire. By Christmas, Bucharest's central square was a theater of gunfire and armored personnel carriers, and the television studio had been seized by rebels improvising a new country into the cameras. In the chaos, soldiers executed the dictator and his wife after a brief tribunal at a garrison. The engineer who kept the studio's transmitters from overheating during those days said later that he had only done his job, which was to keep the signal steady. He remembered the moment the anchor whispered that she didn't know what to read because there was no script for this. Back in Berlin, after midnight on November 10th, the border guards at other crossings followed Bornholmer's example because they were afraid of being the last to do it. People danced on the concrete they had been told was eternally necessary. An older man tapped the wall with a claw hammer he had carried since the 1960s, and then gave it to a teenager who could swing longer. West Berliners came with champagne. East Berliners came with thermoses. Such differences mattered less with each hour. A guard named Harold, who had once written citations in careful penmanship, lowered his eyes as strangers hugged him. He went home at dawn to a wife who had watched the night on television. He said only that the orders had changed. She told him it was all right if he didn't talk yet. Moscow could not call tanks into all the streets at once. The liberalizing policies that had opened space for speech also made it impossible to close each door quickly. Commanders understood that their conscripts were the same age as the students in the squares. Mayors understood that garbage trucks and food deliveries depended on the same citizens holding candles. The logic of the year required choices, and in city after city the cost of crushing outweighed the price of surrender. The exception left deep scars in Romania, but even there the regime collapsed under the weight of its own isolation. The winter that followed felt like waking from a long illness. In Poland, a grocer taped a hand-lettered sign over the meat counter that simply read, "Tomorrow," meaning delivery would come without a bribe. In Budapest, the lieutenant who had looked away at the picnic walked the old fence line and saw only posts cut low to the ground, and weeds already making the difference between countries looked natural. In Prague, the student who had once used a fruit crate for a podium stepped carefully on slick stones to avoid spilling a paper cup of coffee bought without a line. In Leipzig, the nurse kept her Monday habit and found the crowd slimmer with relief. She said she had never liked slogans, but had learned she liked seeing police search someone else for a change. In Berlin, at a stand where 2 currencies had once been required, a woman sold bratwurst to anyone with coins of either kind and gave change with a shrug when she ran out of small denominations. The political map redrew itself by treaties and parliaments, but the change that held was the one inside apartments where phones no longer clicked with extra ears, and in classrooms where a teacher could admit that a pamphlet had lied. Archives would open and close again. Elections would go well and then less well. Nations would argue with neighbors, new and old. The border might be, in places, a museum exhibit more than a memory. Yet the year had shown something plain. Power, once it loosened its grip even slightly, could not convince the people who had tested free breath to stop taking it. At Bornholmer Strasse, decades later, commuters crossed the bridge without noticing the marks where the barrier once pivoted. One night each November, a few thousand gather and tell the story to children too young to remember a divided city. A former captain stands inside the restored control booth and looks at the same windows he once looked out of. He says that orders are a comfort until they aren't. A young woman, whose parents walked past him that night holding hands, listens and takes a picture of the empty roadway. The frame shows nothing extraordinary. The asphalt is clean, the paint is fresh, the light poles are standard issue. She saves the image anyway because her mother told her that for a long time, ordinary life had been what people wanted most and could not have. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.